Hey, this is Stuchu, and for today's video, I wanted to do a video about burnout as an esports journalist or an esports writer. And while this will mostly be focused towards journalism, I imagine there's something applicable to burnout in general. As Musashi once says, those who see the way broadly see it in everything, from the Book of Five Rings. So it may or may not be helpful to you. I'm not exactly certain. I can only speak from my own experiences. And there are multiple reasons why I wanted to do this particular video. The first is it's been about 7 years since I've started writing in esports, written a bunch of different games, StarCraft 2, CSGO, Dota, a bunch of others. So I think I've got a decent grasp of at least some of the internal issues and pressures, though I am a bit weird, so my issues are might be different than others, but I feel like I can at least give my perspective on them. Second reason is because I think this has been like the fifth or sixth wave of like esports journalists I've seen come in, leave the scene. Like for instance, like the StarCraft 2 writer I've been following has been like Meisenhower, but I messaged him recently. He's just kind of out, kind of like lost his interest. Not sure if he'll reignite his interest if like Sue starts winning or whatever, but whatever the case may be, I just wanted to give my advice on some of that because people like Thorne have helped me out in the past, and so I wanted to give I wanted to give some kind of advice to people who are looking to be esports journalists long term. And the last thing I want to point out is I don't actually think anybody should do esports journalism permanently if they don't want to. I feel like everybody has like different things they want to go into in life, and that's completely fine. And I encourage that. Like, if you're not interested in whatever game or whatever scene, just leave. Right? I don't think there's any problem with that. I don't like this. There, like, I don't see any reason why we should say if your interests call you to somewhere else or something else. But this specific video is just for those people who maybe they're still interested, but like they feel like they've completely burned out. And so I wanted to at least explain my own thought processes behind what I think causes burnout, how I think you're supposed to deal with it, and my own experiences. And the thing is my own experiences are a bit different from other people's in the sense that I've never truly felt burned out. Like, there were times I felt tired, but I just like went to sleep. Next day I felt fine. But I did compare my own experiences to other people's, and I think there are certain like mental processes or attitudes that might have been different between me and other people that I think could bring insight into this burnout issue. So we'll go into that. Right. So we're gonna start with example. I think the most important example, in my opinion, is probably Daigo Umehara, which is the legendary Street Fighter player. And the reason I picked him is because he's, as far as I know, the oldest professional esports player in the world. It doesn't matter what game or genre. He's been playing since the early 2000s, and it's 2019 now, so it's almost 20 years. But he's actually been playing a bit longer than that, I believe. He's also like 38 or something crazy. And the reason I'm bringing him up is because this is a guy who went through the entire process pretty early. So if you want, you can read his book, The Will to Keep Winning. It's a pretty good book, in my opinion. Gives a lot of insight into his attitude, his method, his process, and some of like the things he's had to deal with, and when he was younger. So but I'll give you a basic overview of his early on career because that's what we'll be focusing on. So early on, Daigo in his early 2000s was the best fighting game player in the world. And so he kept playing, kept winning, and he kept playing, kept winning. And there was a point where he believed like he had to keep winning no matter what, that he had to defend his title. And he put an enormous amount of pressure on himself. And so he kept winning and kept winning. And back then it was like best of one tournaments from Capcom, and it was like a different game each time. And eventually he lost, right? And then when he lost, he felt like he'd broken because the only thing that was driving him at that point was just the victory itself, because he was somebody who was from what I remember, practicing like 14 to 16 hours a day, just grinding those games over and over again. And it kind of just broke him, and then he just emotionally and spiritually broke. He burned out, and then he moved on, right? And during his sabbatical, he first tried to play mahjong, and he got better at the game. He got a mentor. He worked at a mahjong parlor, and then at the very end, where he personally believes he was about to break through, make a massive breakthrough into the game. He realized he had done the exact same process that had made him the best Street Fighter player, and he realized like the end path was going to be exactly the same as when he had been a Street Fighter player, where he was just going to completely burn out and he was going to lose all interest, and then there would be nothing left for him, right? So he left that, and then he worked at a nursing home for a while, and that kind of gave him a bit more perspective and a bit of time to sort of reflect on what he had done wrong, why he had kind of just burned out on everything. And he realized that when he was a mahjong player, when he was a Street Fighter player, he was focused almost exclusively on short-term gains or short-term goals. So for instance, when he was a Street Fighter player, he'd be like, okay, this time I want to win this tournament. And then after that, he'd be like, okay, I need to win this next tournament. Then I need to win this next tournament. And he realized, even though that motivation gave him a lot of power in the short term, in the long term, it wasn't sustainable. He couldn't just keep doing that forever, because as he came to realize, like, the gains from winning a tournament were significantly less, like the emotional gains from winning a tournament were significantly less than the emotional losses from losing these tournaments, and the amount of pressure and effort he had to put into the game to be that great. And he realized he was doing the same thing in mahjong, right? And so he kind of just realized, okay, that's not sustainable. And then the other thing he realized was he was trying to hold on to something that was never really his. And what I mean by that is he was in his book, he basically describes how he wanted to hold on to the title of number one, of being the best there ever was, never will be, etc., etc. And he came to the realization that that was not accurate, or that was not the correct path, because instead of that being the goal, instead he kind of reverted his goal, because he realized, like, that's not something you can truly attain, or perhaps it wasn't something he could attain with that kind of mindset, because, like, he was just going to burn out. And we kind of realized he had to go a bit more steady, and instead of focusing on the goal of being number one, the goal of winning things, he instead focused on the process that he believed would eventually take him to number one. And for him, the process was constant improvement, constant experimentation, and just consistent practice, where he focused more on the process of what he was doing rather than the results of what he was doing. And that was eventually what brought him out of that funk and made him, at least in the early Street Fighter 4 period, the best player in the world again. And since then, he's been pretty shockingly good, considering how old he is, and like how stubborn he can be, at least in terms of his playstyle, because his playstyle is very, like, he won't run from any fight. He will literally, like, he will recognize a opponent's style of play and then try to play directly into it, because for Daigo, like, the victory itself is an afterthought of being the best. Like, for Daigo, you should only aim for total victory, as in you need to be so fucking great that when the victory screen comes on, your opponent recognizes the fact that at his very best he couldn't beat you. That's kind of Daigo's mentality, is like, I beat you in your own game. And that's also why he famously keeps getting knocked out, like, randomly by like random people, like most famously Filipino champ in Street Fighter, because, you know, that's not really Filipino champ's main game, or John Choi when he randomly showed up again. It's because, like, if you look at those games, if you look at Daigo's career overall, that's just how he's always the reason he's more susceptible to underdog losses was because he was willing to he was willing to play directly into like these underdog strengths, and he didn't have the experience or didn't have the knowledge at the time to beat them, right? And the reason I've gone on this transgression is because if is because I want you to contrast what I just said about Daigo's current sort of mentality compared to his past. In his past, he was winning everything, and then one day he lost, and like I think it might have been his third or fourth Capcom tournament in the 2000s he lost, where he was like in the round of 8 or the round 16 or something. He got eliminated. Nowadays, he can get eliminated in like early on in like the group stages of like an Evo or whatever, and it won't break him mentally. He'll just keep playing over and over and over again because he's fundamentally changed his process of what he wants from the game. Where instead of wanting the victory, he wants to be the best, and he's recognized the fact that being the best isn't correlated to he doesn't want to be the best. He wants to be the best he can be, which is important and different caveat. But basically, he recognizes the fact that the process he's walking down, that is the most important thing, and the results afterwards will get him the previous will eventually correlate to his process. But for him, the process is the most important aspect. And for an esports journalist, I think that's critical. I just think in life that's critical. Like, you don't want your short-term goals to be your overarching goals. Like, for instance, I see some people just complain all the time on Twitter, like, oh, I should have won that esports award or whatever. And I think that is the completely wrong mindset. What you should be thinking about is, what is the process by which I can be the best journalist I can be, or whatever. And then if you keep improving that process, eventually you win it, or eventually you don't. But in either case, you'll be the best person you can possibly be. Or basically, what I'm saying is, like, when I see a bunch of these esports journalists, like, I feel like they focus too much on the short-term goal, which is, I want to write this article, or I want this award, I want X player to recognize me, I want Y person to recognize me. Whereas I think the overall process is the most important aspect of your work. And that is, I suppose, the guiding light. The guiding light that won't burn you out. Because when you consider burnout in general, I think most of it comes from emotional or spiritual burnout. And a lot of that comes from I guess it would come from disparity in how you relate to the world, right? So sometimes disparity in how you view the world and how the world views you. Like, in some cases, I see some people burn out just because they think like it's kind of unjust. They're like, I'm way better than this person or that person, but I'm not getting the same recognition, whatever. And like I said before, I just think that's the wrong way to look about it. You're not trying to get X recognition. You're not trying to get whatever. You're trying to improve the process, and that will get you all the rest of it as a byproduct. But that's all just ancillary stuff. That's all just secondary stuff. But instead, they focus on the secondary stuff. And if you do, then you're going to feed into your negative emotions more, like envy, hatred, jealousy. These are all things I've seen pop up time and time again. And instead of focusing on the inherent joys of like improving yourself, you're more focused on how you are perceived relative to other people. And I think that's just, first off, that's always going to be a losing game, because you will never be able to control public perceptions. Like, maybe you can influence them, you'll never truly control them. Like, public perceptions come and go, and that's not a steady anchor on which to build a writing career, or whatever you want to call it. And I think it just feeds into the worst aspects of the human psyche in that sense. So that's why I went through that entire Daigo diatribe, because I think Daigo hit the nail on the head. Like, I think, and I don't think you need to go through his entire process just to reach his conclusions, or at least take parts of his conclusions and apply them to your own life. He's already done it for you. He's already written it. Just go read that book if you don't believe me. And you can just borrow his lessons. You don't need to go through the exact same punishing sort of analogous tribulations he did, since he's already gone through it for you and he's opened the doors. Just copy your shit and then refine it or use it for your own use. And then the other thing you have to think about, like the other way I think about this is through the use of stoicism. So like I said before, emotional burnout generally comes from, I think, the disparity between your of how you view yourself and how you think the world views you, and then in relation to you versus your competitors, or you versus like other random people or whatever, right? And I think when it comes to stoicism, there are two things I've really grasped onto. You can either read like Letters from a Stoic by Seneca, or you can read Marcus Aurelius's Meditations. But basically, the two things you want to think about are effort and resignation. And at least that's how I kind of define it. But basically, the effort part of Stoicism is you have to recognize the areas in which you can improve yourself, that you have control and complete dominion over yourself. So regardless of whether you succeed or fail, you know that in that situation you had control over it. You had fate in your hands, and so you can't really. It's hard. It's much harder to complain when you had like 90 to 100% of control of a particular situation, right? And so those are the situations where your efforts kind of bear fruit. And then resignation, or the power of it, is recognizing the moments where you don't really have a choice, and because you don't really have a choice, you recognize the fact that it's out of your hands. And if it's out of your hands, why should you care, right? And so that's kind of how I think about it. And the difference between me and some other people is like, I don't get emotionally affected by situations that I personally feel are truly out of my control. Now, this is a slippery slope in the sense that you might start resigning moments or your feelings to moments where there is some level of control you could have had. But in general, I just think like there are some things that are just like completely out of control. Like for instance, like if I had a deadline and like I happen to have a blackout, well, there's not really much I can do, right? Like my city I'm in happens to have a blackout. There's not much I can do. I can't really write, can't really communicate or whatever. But in that sense, there's no reason to worry or put pressure on myself to get something done. Instead, but that's like part of the resignation part. Whereas like the effort part would be like, okay, so I can't really write, I can't really research stuff, but I can analyze stuff in my head. I can think about different ideas. I can like write it down in a notebook and then like reprocess it onto like a word processor later. That'll cut me time. I can think about this. I can point out things I want to research later. Like these are all things you could do. And so when you combine these two aspects, you feel like, yeah, I couldn't control this situation, but I put in the effort on my side. And when you do that, it feels like even though you don't have control of your destiny, you gave yourself the best shot. And by doing that, it feels like there's, at least personally, there's a lot less emotional burnout or emotional conflict from that side. So the other thing I want to talk about, at least when it comes to burnout, is like I've talked about like your perceptions. The other thing you want to think about is what you want to do compared to what people want you to do. And this is kind of a weird subject, but basically the other aspect I find like can cause burnout is if you're put in a situation where, all right, well, it's been a few years. It's not like it exists anymore, but basically like there was a time where I could have been like an editor of like an esports website. I won't name them, but basically I was offered this job, and then they're like, okay, so but if you want to be an editor, here's what you have to do, right? You have to like basically teach a bunch of like news writers how to write, how to go through all of that stuff, and then you have to edit it, and then you have to post it. You have to yeah, you have to get in contact with orgs, get the photo credits, all that stuff, right? And then on the side, you can do your like one feature per month or one feature per week or whatever it is. And even though it paid well, like I think at the time I believe I just went like a freelancer route, even though I'd be paid like significantly less. And the reason I did that was because of what I believe is what I call like constructive work. The constructive work dilemma, which is like basically this is the type of burnout I see in like regular normal people's lives where like work needs to be constructive. It needs to mean something and have some value to you personally. And what I mean by that is like it doesn't it doesn't necessarily have to have like spiritual or like community value. It just needs to have some kind of personal value. So it doesn't really matter if like how do I explain this? So basically, there are things I'm interested in that probably don't have like that much value, but like you personally are interested in them, or like there's another type of value is like progressive value, like you're getting better at this aspect, so maybe it's not helpful to do for the overall community, or maybe not that much for yourself, but because you're improving, there is a satisfaction in improving in a field of business or a field of study or whatever, right? And so that's what I call like constructive work, which is like work where you're either doing something you love, something like you think will help the community or whatever, or something that you consistently progress in. Now, work burnout generally comes from moments where you're doing something that doesn't have to do with any of those three things. And that is something you have to be cautious of, because I think even if you get paid more, I think you're you're more liable to burn out if you let yourself do these things that are that you don't find that much value in. Like for instance, I personally I've almost never like written users, even though that's as far as I can tell the normal route for becoming an esports journalist. I did other things. I'd always been more interested in other things, and so even at moments where I could have done it, and I never did it because I kind of recognize the fact that the more of these I do, the more kind of emotional burnout I'd end up having, and that would just cut down my interest in the game or the scene or whatever. So you have to figure out for yourself what you consider constructive work and what you consider kind of useless work. Like I think Bertrand Russell, and it's like in the 1930s, he wrote a book, The Pursuit of Happiness, whatever. And he basically describes he kind of describes at the time, and I guess now, the future sort of conflict that you see a bunch of like mainstream journalists have. And he says like the problem with literary types like journalists is that they hire themselves to rich corporations directed by Philistines. Thus their inherent nature is shackled, and their self and society are not unified and come into conflict. They prostitute their skill to a livelihood that they believe to be harmful, and in doing so, they become so cynical they no longer enjoy anything. All right, and so that's like obviously that's an extreme sort of thing, but in general, like you don't want to do things that you either consider harmful or you consider like busy work or stuff like that. You like sometimes they're necessary, sometimes you have to do them, but you want to minimize that, and you want to focus on things you consider meaningful, even if like the rest of the world does it. Like for instance, I think there are things I probably could do that could ensure me like a bigger paycheck or whatever, but they're not things I'm interested in, and so I'd be selling in a sense my happiness, my happiness for money. And you know what? Sometimes that is a trade you should take. That is sometimes a trade you must take because, become survival first before everything else. But if you happen to be in a position where you can, like you are financially stable, then I'd argue it's the opposite. Where like once you get financially stable, you want to do things you want to do rather than things that'll get you more money at the cost of like personal happiness or personal success. Because I think the emotional toll that eventually takes on you will burn you out faster. So that's something to consider. All right. What what is next? All right. Another thing I want to talk about is hobbies. And the reason I want to talk about this is because, as far as I can tell, a majority of esports journalists are just super hobbyists or start off as super hobbyists. So there's diehard fans who get super into a game or scene or a community, and they kind of dissect everything. And honestly speaking, they're like usually my favorite types of journalists because they'll go in way deeper than normal, and so you have way more insight into their personal, into their into like a game or a story or whatever that you normally couldn't get from a mainstream journalist or whatever. So the reason I want to talk about hobbies is I personally think hobbies are fairly important, just as a living human being, because they give you three things. They give you a psychological field of relaxation where like you kind of escape from reality, right? And that's the second thing is like it's an escape from reality. So you get to relax, you get to escape from your everyday job or everyday grind. And then the third thing it does is it gives you like a place of obvious progression, usually speaking. And what I mean by that is like even if you're just like a sports fan or whatever, like the progression comes from like some people if you're like a fan of a specific team or whatever, their progression comes directly tied to the team. But in my case, it would be like from my increased understanding of a particular field of competitive gaming or whatever, right? And that's or like or progression of my increased understanding of something, or if I was like playing StarCraft, to be like my progression would become from like my raising rank in the ladder. But as a tangent, I actually think that's a bad way to measure progression. I think your better way to measure progression is you have to like categorize all your sub skills and then try to improve them one by one. But that's like a different topic altogether. And the reason I'm talking about hobbies for esports journalists is because I don't think a lot of them kind of recognize the fact that they're turning their hobby into like their pseudo career. Obviously, I don't think there's that many people who actually get paid by it, but they do spend enough time that it become that in terms of raw hours, they're like spending 8 hours a day or more in 7 days a week, and so that's kind of more than a job, right? So in that sense, if you do turn your esports hobby into like this writing career, you need to do something else with your life. And what I mean by that is like you need another hobby from this hobby, right? And so if you do that, then you'll have a better escape. You'll have a place because basically what's happening, at least psychologically speaking, from my point of view, is you're turning this place that used to be your like field of relaxation, your escape from reality, and like this place of progression, and then you're kind of turning it into a normal space where you're you're now working is now part of your real time life, and the progression you're trying to find from there is fundamentally different than what it was before. Like before, it was just like, oh, I know more about the scene, or I'm like following a specific team, a specific region, or whatever. Whereas like now, it's like, oh, I have to write this article. I want this many tweets. I want this many hits, or whatever random short term goal or whatever you're looking for, right? And so, if that happens, then you no longer have an obvious outlet, and some people just don't recognize this until it's too late, and then they completely burn themselves out. And so, personally speaking, like I just use you can use other things like reading. Like I read a bunch of books, read comics, watch movies, watch TV shows, watch other games. Like famously, I think I watch a shit ton of esports games, and some of them are just hobbies on the side. I just write about every once in a while, like FGC. I do that like every once in a while. I'll write like a Daigo piece or like a Taquito piece or whatever. But in general, like that's more of a hobby than it is something I do seriously. Or like I'll watch NBA or I'll watch the NFL or something like that. Like that's not me trying to. Basically, that's just me making another hobby for my work that used to be a hobby, right? And what's great about this is like the more you do this, like the more you expand your hobbies and interests and whatever, the more you're going to see how everything kind of relates, everything's kind of connected, how the models of like humanity and competitiveness and all that stuff kind of translate and repeat over a wide variety of different types of fields, and kind of gives you more insight into your own work. And so it creates this kind of loop where you go to work and then that's great, and then you go do your hobby, and even though it feels like your hobby isn't related to work, that stuff you take from there can improve your own work in a way. So I'd say making sure you have another hobby outside of esports is pretty critical, at least in dealing with burnout. And the last thing I want to talk about is credentials, I guess. I think basically this comes from like a Malcolm X quote where he said, "Sincerity is my only credential." For journalists, I think they only have two credentials above everything else. That's their honesty and their sincerity. And the reason I think these are the two most important credentials is because I think if you don't keep those, I think you're eventually going to burn out anyway, or you're just not going to be very good just as a journalist. Because I personally believe like you want when you're doing this kind of work, and what I mean this kind of work is like opinion pieces like what I do, or like if you're like an analyst, you want to give like your honest answer, your honest opinion about anything. And so honesty and sincerity are the most important things, because first off, it's the only way, honesty at least is the only way people will understand and believe what you're saying. And if you sell that, then you don't really have anything as a journalist, to be honest. You're kind of just a shill at that point, I think. Like you can have like all the you can have all like the journalism degrees you want, but if you don't keep your honesty and sincerity, you don't really exist. I don't think you truly exist as a journalist, right? And the other thing I want to talk about is like sincerity, and that's you have to believe in what you're saying. And as long as you keep those two things, it doesn't necessarily matter whether you're right or wrong at any given moment. What matters is like you believe what you're saying and you're giving the honest truth of what you're saying at any given point. And that will, I think those are like if you take anything from this, those are the two most important aspects of, I think, being a journalist and doing it for a long period of time. Because I think if you let go of those, like everything else is going to degrade anyway. So, and maybe you'll get paid more. Maybe journalism at this point, you do get paid more for being dishonest and being insincere or whatever. But like, just as a person, I personally just think it's just better to keep those two as your most important, psychological anchors to your career. And also, I think they're also the best warning signs, because if you're honest and sincere with yourself, you'll recognize the moments where you have disunity between what you want and what the world wants. You'll recognize the moments where like you're comparing yourself too much to community beliefs or community perceptions. And you also recognize the moments where you're like, oh, I guess I'm just not that interested in the game or the scene anymore, so I can just leave, right? Like there is no I think that's also a big plus. So overall, I think that's everything I wanted to say. See you guys later.